Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my online talk, first one ever. I guess now we're going to find out if my jokes are just as funny when they're clearly planned and when I can't tell if you're laughing, so bear with me here. This is me. Hello, I'm Kelly. I'm from California Polytechnic State University, or better known as Cal Poly, in San Luis Obispo, California. I'm here to tell you about my new package, which is called Flair. So let me hide out in the corner here and get started. So here's the idea of this package. Basically, sometimes when you are making an R Markdown report or presentation, you have your source code being displayed, and you want to do some kind of highlighting to it. And the problem with this is, if you do this kind of the old-fashioned way, it's very unreproducible. So tell me if you've ever done something like this, if this is relatable to you. I have. Let's suppose you're making a slide for your class or whatever, and you say, let's learn about box plots, and you've got your box plot code making the beautiful box plots right here, comparing the body masses of 3 penguin species. And alas, you've copy-pasted your code so that you can put that highlighting on the geometry. You're trying to teach these kids, here's how you do box plots. You've highlighted the geometry, but oh no, you copy-pasted this code from an earlier version of your class, you decided to change what you were teaching, or maybe this is a later slide, and you forgot to change histogram to box plot. And in fact, in this code, there's another mistake. It's right here. Body mass B instead of body mass G is the actual variable name. That actually was a typo that I made not on purpose, and I decided to leave it just to show you exactly how nefarious this can be. If you're needing to duplicate your code every time that you teach it, sometimes you end up duplicating wrong or failing to fix a problem in the duplicated code that you fixed in the real code, and it really confuses your students or your learners. So that was the motivation behind writing this Flair package. It's very, very frustrating when I'm trying to make these code examples and demonstrate something in lecture. So the Flair package is on CRAN. You can get to it with install.packages. It doesn't play nice with R 4.0. Pro tip, don't write a package right before a major release. The version on GitHub, the developer version, does play nice with Flair, with R 4.0, but there are some other little quirks that it's doing right now, so I'll just say beware. Install the CRAN version, or if you're using 4.0, try out the dev version, but be warned that there might be some pitfalls there that I'm not aware of. So here's how this works, very straightforward. Main functions in the package. Works like this. Step 1, you've got your code chunk with your code that you are interested in decorating. So here I've got a code chunk, I've given it a name, very important that you give it a label. I've called it how to pipe, and maybe I'm doing a demonstration here of how we can group by and summarize using the pipe. So this is what your source code looks like, and I've added include equals false because we don't actually want this code or its results to display in your final version, not at least until it has been decorated. So your step 2, we use the decorate function from the Flair package, and all we give it is that label, so this is why you need to label the chunk. There's the label for your chunk, how to pipe, and we move along. Next step, we need to add some Flair to our package, to our source code. And so this is with the Flair functions, or there's a variety of Flair underscore variants of this original Flair function. So we've decorated our code chunk, and then we pipe that along to the Flair function. So here I've said what I want to Flair is the pipe, and maybe I also want to highlight in some way the functions. So I'm trying to show my students we're piping into a function. And so there's this Flair underscore funds, which is a shortcut for flaring all the functions in the source code. And I've said, let's make the text color cornflower blue. By default, the Flair does a regular yellow highlighting, much like you see here. In fact, I did use Flair on this example to create this example. But you can do other different text formatting as well. Really anything that is HTML possible is possible in Flair. And that's it. So once you've decorated and you've flared, you're done. So here it is all together. There's the original Flair source code. We ordinarily wouldn't print that, but that's what's happening under the hood. Here's what the output looks like. We have our source code properly decorated. The pipe is highlighted. The functions are blue. And of course, it also runs the code and gives the output. And so we're not duplicating that source code. Whatever's getting flared is also exactly what's getting run. So that's the basics of it. So just some common questions that I get about this. First of all, does it work in, extra R Markdown packages? Absolutely. I think it will work for any R Markdown-based document of any kind because it is relying on kind of the inherent R Markdown knitting code. But I suppose there could be quirks. Please let me know if you find any. Definitely it works with Sheringan and with IO slides and a lot of the common R Markdown variants. So you might ask, this is all designed for knitting. So we have those chunks that have the decorate and the flair functions in them. What happens if you just run those in a console or in your kind of notebook source code? What it's going to do is it's actually going to preview the flaring. So it's going to pop up in your viewer pane the source code that you are trying to decorate, and it will show you what's being highlighted and how. So you can double check that what's happening is what you intended to happen with the flaring. And lastly, I know a lot of people want this for LaTeX. It is definitely on our agenda. We don't have it yet. I don't know when we'll be able to write that functionality in, but it's definitely already on the radar. We really want this to be available for knitting to LaTeX and knitting to Word maybe one day as well. Right now it's only for HTML. So I want to show you a few of my favorite things to do with this package, how I've been using it myself in my work. First of all, I originally wrote it and I find it really nice for emphasizing the results of changing little bits of code. So when you're teaching or demonstrating code, perhaps you want to do something like this. Here I've got a code chunk called geomes, and what I'm trying to show is the difference between the column geometry and the line geometry. Both of these take an x and a y variable and some kind of coloring variable. Those also change the coloring variable if you want them to actually affect the elements of the plot. And so I want to demonstrate to students how these two very similar bits of code change the output of your plot. So what I'm going to do, well, I'm going to flair it. I'm going to decorate that code. I'm going to flair these different coloring these different geometry elements and also the different coloring elements. So those are the things that I want to highlight in these differences. And then when I knit my document with those two chunks, well, here's what I see. There's the first one, and we see it's got fill and geom col, and it's got this kind of column plot by year. What we're seeing here is actually how many babies were named Kelly in a given year in California. And so we can sort of see the trend where the gender of those babies, or at least gender assigned at birth, changed a little bit over time. It used to be a uncommon but primarily male name. Now it's a fairly common female name, but declining. And so if we wanted to display this in a slightly different way without these columns by year, but instead kind of as a continuous gradient, we could switch to geom line. There we go. Then we'd want to change our other aesthetic from fill to color so that we're seeing the lines be colored. And la-di-da. Now a student can very clearly see what changing those elements will do to their code. All right, second thing that I love to do with this is to match the colors in the code to the concepts. So this was inspired by this great slide made by Andrew Heiss. You can find him on Twitter. This is awesome. He has made a diagram and also a set of code and also an equation where the matching elements are the same color in each spot. This is such a great teaching tool where we can match the idea behind the equation they might have seen in a theoretical class to the code they might have seen in an applied class, and also make a diagram sort of explaining the relationship between these variables. So here's how you would do that. So here's our flaring, and we can actually flare plain old text. You actually don't have to send code to flare. You can use it if you want to for HTML wrapping on text elements. So here's my description. The model has a response variable, two predictors, and an interaction term, and I'm going to flare those all in different colors, pink, blue, and orange. I've also added here some special HTML tags to make the text appear nicely. And so then I'm going to flare the code. So here's my model. It's a simple linear model on those baby names, the Kellys in California. And then I want to use the same colors to flare those three elements that I used in the text description. And so there's the output. The response variable is pink in both cases, predictors are blue in both cases, and interaction term is orange. And we can really see how this concept of the model translates to the code. And again, we're still getting the output from the same source code that's getting decorated. Lastly, my favorite trick, probably the one I use the absolute most, and it wasn't even my idea, so thank you, Allison Hill, for this one. This is masking. So I like to give this quiz in my class, or similar ones. I say, here is some code, here is the output, but I have covered up for you certain elements of the code. And I ask the students to fill in these blanks. They need to be able to look at the output and reverse engineer the code. But sometimes it's hard to just say, here's the output, write the entire code that recreates it. It's a little nicer to give some scaffolding or to narrow down what you're trying to test. So here we have blanks for the aesthetic and the geometries and the theme, and if these are things that I've taught in a given week, then this is a nice way to quiz them with complete correct answers. And so how this looks, well, very simple. I don't even need to show you the source code of the original chunk, you just saw it, but I decorate it. I'm gonna flair some regular expressions here. So notice this flair rx is something that you don't just have to give the exact text. You can use regular expressions if you're comfortable with them. And then what I've done is I've masked a whole bunch of things. I've masked all of these elements of the aesthetic and of the geometry that I'm trying to test. So those are my 3 tricks. That's how to use Flair. If you came here as someone who just wants to pick up this package and use it, you're done. You can stop here. The last bit of this talk is for the developers. So feel free to go to the GitHub for Flair, feel free to install from Cran, and definitely contact me if you have any thoughts, either at my Twitter or this is my personal website. Now let me spend my last 5 minutes talking about how this package actually works, how I wrote it, in the hope that some of you are maybe interested in building off of it or contributing to it. So here's how it works. It kind of centers around this new S3 object called a with_flair object. And so that decorate function, what it does is it takes the code chunk name, processes the code chunk, and creates an object of the class with_flair. And really what all this is a list. It's actually identical to the output of knit_child. I'm relying on this knit_child function from the knitter package. And I've also attached some attributes to that list to keep track of where certain things are located. And it also comes with a print method as well as a knitting method, a knit print method, which is just to print it out as is. This with_flair object is already in the form of having HTML, and so we just want to display that exactly as is. So that decorate function, very important. This is doing the heavy lifting here. This is the bulk of the package. What it's going to do, well, first it checks out the current state of the world. So you're running this presumably in R Markdown. It's written for R Markdown. So it checks whether you're in the knitting engine or whether you're just interacting with a notebook in your RStudio pane. And then it also tracks the global options that you've set in that R Markdown document, and then the chunk-specific options for each chunk that needs to be decorated. So then it does all this regular expression text processing searching. All the point of that is to find the chunks that are being flared, and then each of those flare chunks it's going to knit individually. So it uses that knit child to kind of make a baby document and knit those chunks and get back the results, and then go back to the parent document and see what to do with them. And so finally the flair function takes this with_flair object you've just created, it knows where the source code is located, it searches through it based on what you've asked it to flair, it wraps HTML tags to give the appropriate formatting, and then it returns back also still a with_flair object. It preserves that class so that you can send it through that pipeline. And so basically the whole deal, all we're doing is we are pre-knitting all those child chunks, and then we are doing the flair process on each chunk, so we are adding the decoration. And then in the final knitting step, we're just asking it to knit that output as is because we've already pre-knitted it. So if you're still with me, let me tell you how you can help. So, syntax highlighting. Syntax highlighting is a challenge here. Here's how this normally works in R Markdown. So normally R Markdown and Knitr, they basically take that source code, they run it, they store the source text and the output in a list, and then they insert that list back into the document. And then this document goes through Pandoc, and the way that Pandoc handles that source text is it fences it. By which I mean it puts these tick marks in R, very similar to a code chunk in R Markdown, but not quite identical. And the reason it does that is because those fences are recognizable to JavaScript. So this JavaScript script called highlight.js is going through and processing source text. So it's looking for this fenced source code and syntax highlighting it according to the language. So that's kind of a problem for Flair, because what it means is that the syntax highlighting of your code isn't happening until the point where that document is displayed on the browser. In fact, if you want to inspect the document, you'll see that fenced code rather than something that is formatted with colors and so forth. But Flair is happening at the knitting step, so Flair is happening when the R code initially gets processed. So to be honest, I'm not sure how to marry those two things, because the syntax highlighting is happening way after, but it only happens to things that are recognized as source code. And we've already at the very beginning pre-knitted the source code and kind of taken away that designation so that we can put Flair decorations on it. There's not really a way to make those happen in the opposite order, at least not a way that I know of. So I'm hopeful. In all my talks, I like to put out a call to arms, and this is the one for flair. If you have an idea for how we might incorporate syntax highlighting into this process, that would be fantastic. I think that's the biggest thing missing from the package right now. Regardless, I hope the package is helpful to you, even in its current state, without the syntax highlighting. Again, find it on Crayon, find it on GitHub, or find me. And thanks so much for watching this video. I'm looking forward to seeing all of yours.